Welcome to Mill History Talk, the podcast where we explore the past to better understand the profession of arms today. We dive into the campaigns, conflicts, issues, and commanders that have shaped military thinking across centuries, and why it all still matters. Whether you're an officer in training, a seasoned professional, a student of strategy, or simply curious about how history informs modern warfare, this space is for you. Our mission is simple: to foster insight, reflection, and critical thinking primarily through the lens of military history. Before we begin, a quick note. The views expressed in this podcast are of the podcast writers, hosts, and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any government agency or organization. So, whether you're listening in a barracks, a lecture hall, at the gym, or in your car on the way to work, welcome. We're glad you're here. Hey everyone, I'm Hope, your slightly nerdy, definitely caffeinated guide through the chaos of military history. This is Mill History Talk, where battles meet banter and history gets a little less dusty.
And I'm Brian, your resident historian, occasional buzzkill, and here mostly to keep Hope from comparing Napoleon to a reality TV contestant again.
You say that like Napoleon wouldn't have thrived on The Bachelor Empire Edition. But today we're talking about something a little less romantic: the death of an army. Specifically, the British Expeditionary Force in 1914.
Right. A small professional army that fought brilliantly in France during the opening months of World War I and was nearly destroyed within 4 months.
So basically, Britain sends 80,000 elite soldiers into a war involving millions, and they get crushed by the sheer scale of it. Why did they even think that was going to work, Brian?
Because that's how Britain had always fought its wars. A small, professional army backed by naval power. They'd never needed mass mobilization before. The Royal Navy was their big stick.
So they're still thinking empire policing, not industrial apocalypse.
Exactly. The BEF was built for colonial campaigns. Fast, mobile, disciplined. Not for continental-scale slaughter.
All right, so let's set the scene. August 1914. Germany's invading Belgium, France is in trouble, and Britain sends its best and brightest. 80,000 men. What were these soldiers like?
They were professionals, career soldiers, many veterans of the Boer War. Their training was exceptional. They could fire 15 aimed rounds a minute with the Lee Enfield rifle. The Germans actually thought they were facing machine guns.
Wait, 15 aimed shots per minute? That's insane. My trigger finger cramps just thinking about it.
They trained for it. The Mad Minute, they called it. Years of drill and discipline. When the Germans advanced at Mons on August 23rd, that rifle fire tore through them.
So, first contact, Mons. Britain's outnumbered 2-1, but they still stopped the German First Army cold. That must have felt like a win.
It did, briefly. But it was a tactical success inside a strategic disaster. The Germans just had too many men. The BEF had to retreat or be annihilated.
That's the thing that keeps blowing my mind. The BEF won almost every tactical fight, but kept losing strategically. Was it just numbers?
Numbers and logistics. The Germans could keep feeding men and ammunition forward. The British couldn't. They were operating far from supply depots, across unfamiliar terrain, with no real reserves.
So Mons turns into a fighting retreat, and then 3 days later, Le Cateau happens. I love that story. General Horace Smith Dorrien basically disobeys orders to stand and fight, right?
Right. Command wanted him to keep retreating, but he saw his men were exhausted. He chose to fight, and that stand at Le Cateau, August 26, 1914, probably saved a BEF.
Saved them how?
By buying time. His Second Corps held the line for most of the day, delaying the German advance long enough for the rest of the army to escape encirclement. It was heroic, but costly. Nearly 8,000 casualties in a single day.
8,000 out of 80,000. 10% gone in one battle. How do you even keep fighting after that?
You don't. Not effectively. The BEF was bleeding away its best-trained soldiers with no replacements coming. But Smith-Dorrien's stand delayed the Germans and disrupted their timetable. It's one of those tragic victories.
So, brilliant tactics, doomed strategy. Got it. But I have to ask, did Britain know they were sending such a small force into an impossible situation?
They knew the risks, but underestimated how fast the Germans could move. They expected a slower campaign. No one realized they were stepping into industrialized warfare.
So we're watching 19th century training slam into 20th century technology.
Exactly. Rifles and courage against machine guns and mass artillery.
And that takes us to Ypres, right? The final act of the BEF's original force?
Yes, October 1914, the First Battle of Ypres. The Germans threw 320,000 men at the British and French lines. The BEF had maybe half that. They held, barely.
But the cost was catastrophic. 58,000 British casualties. That's the heart of the army gone.
By November, the old contemptibles, the professional corps of the BEF, were practically wiped out. The survivors were exhausted, and replacements were raw recruits.
So by the end of 1914, Britain's professional army was basically gone. That's wild. How does an empire just lose its best soldiers in a few months and still stay in the war?
Because they adapted. They mobilized reserves, raised Kitchener's new army, and turned a small professional force into a massive citizen army. But that's getting ahead of ourselves.
But let me ask one last question. Do you think the BEF story is one of heroism or failure?
Both. Heroism on the battlefield, failure in preparation. The soldiers did everything right. The system sent them into a war it didn't understand.
So, a masterclass in professionalism and a master warning about scale.
Exactly.
So by the end of 1914, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had fought brilliantly at Mons, Le Cateau, and Ypres. But that original force was gone.
And we're not talking took heavy losses gone. We're talking 90,000 casualties gone. That's basically the entire force that landed in France just a few months earlier.
The BEF wasn't destroyed in one catastrophic battle. It was worn down, day by day. The Germans had the numbers, the artillery, and the logistics to keep the pressure on constantly.
So what actually killed the BEF? Was it bad leadership, bad luck, or just math finally catching up?
Mostly math, and the mismatch between Britain's strategy and the war it walked into. The BEF was designed to support France, not fight a continental war alone. Britain expected to play a supporting role, but Germany's Schlieffen Plan turned it into an all-out, large-scale industrial fight almost overnight.
So Britain brought a rapier to a sledgehammer fight.
That's about right. The BEF could win tactical engagements, but they couldn't replace losses. When the Germans lost a division, they mobilized another. When the British lost a battalion, that experience was gone forever.
Okay, that's the manpower issue. But what about logistics? I mean, you always say wars are won by logistics and lost by politicians. So where did things go wrong?
Everywhere, really. The BEF's supply lines stretched hundreds of miles as they retreated from Belgium to the Marne. Ammunition, food, even water. Everything lagged behind. There were days when soldiers fought without resupply, sleeping in fields, marching 20 miles under constant pursuit.
That sounds miserable. No wonder morale cracked.
It did. The soldiers were professional, but exhaustion and attrition broke down even the best trained units. You can be the best marksman in the world, but it doesn't matter if you haven't slept or eaten in 2 days.
So they were physically drained, strategically isolated, and politically misunderstood. That's a recipe for collapse. But here's what I'm wondering. Could Britain have avoided this? Could they have sent a bigger army earlier?
Not realistically. Britain didn't have the manpower infrastructure for mass mobilization in 1914. It was a professional volunteer army, small by design. Conscription didn't come until 1916. They were fighting the war they were prepared for, not the one they got.
And that's the scary part, right? Because that same logic could apply today. Small, high-tech professional armies assuming they'll only fight limited wars until they run into a peer adversary with millions of troops.
Exactly. That's why the BEF story is more than just a World War I cautionary tale. It's a warning for modern militaries preparing for large-scale combat operations, or LSCO.
Let's unpack that. If you had to list the BEF's biggest mistakes that modern armies could still make, what would they be?
3 things. First, no strategic depth. The BEF had no reserve forces to replace casualties. Second, fragile logistics. They couldn't sustain prolonged operations. And third, failure to adapt. They were trained for mobile, open battle, not the static industrial slaughter that followed.
All right, let's take those one at a time. Strategic depth. What does that mean in plain English?
It means having enough trained manpower to replace your losses and sustain a fight. The BEF didn't. Once their professionals fell, they had to recruit and train new soldiers from scratch. That takes months, sometimes years.
So today's volunteer militaries, like the US, the UK, Canada, they face that same problem. You can't just conjure up a new brigade overnight.
Exactly. Modern armies are smaller and more specialized than ever. That's great for efficiency, but dangerous in a long, high-intensity conflict.
All right, lesson 1. Size still matters. What about logistics?
Logistics was the silent killer of the BEF. They couldn't move supplies fast enough to keep up with their retreat. Modern militaries have more technology, but they're also more dependent on complex systems that can break down or get hacked.
So if someone jams your comms or hits your supply convoys with drones, it's 1914 all over again, but with worse coffee.
Pretty much. Sustaining an army in a contested environment is still the hardest part of warfare.
Okay, last one. Adaptation. The BEF didn't adapt fast enough. Why?
Because no one expected trench warfare. Their tactics were built around maneuver and rifle fire, not surviving artillery barrages. By the time they adapted, the professional corps was gone.
So they were too good at the last war and unprepared for the next one.
That's the curse of every army in history.
So, to bring this home, what's the modern takeaway? What should a small professional force remember from the BEF's fate?
That excellence and bravery aren't enough in a large-scale war. You need depth, resilience, and flexibility. Otherwise, even an elite force can burn out in months. Modern forces that are serious about fighting in a LSCO environment should strategically be prepared to expand rapidly. They must have ready reserves that can be mobilized.
And what about logistics?
Logistics capability has to be just as flexible as the combat forces. It needs to be able to provide timely support anywhere on the battlefield, and in an environment where the enemy will be actively trying to disrupt the effort. Also, at the strategic level, the strategic base must be able to not only provide the manpower to simultaneously replace losses and expand the size of the force, but it also has to be able to provide high-technology equipment at scale to equip the force.
And alliances, right? Because the BEF only survived thanks to the French and Belgians holding the rest of the line.
Exactly. Coalition warfare saved them, but it also showed how hard alliances are to coordinate. Different doctrines, different priorities. It's complicated. Lack of combined training and language and communications issues also contributed to the BEF's problems.
So, the BEF's experience basically says, build reserves, protect your logistics, stay adaptable, and play well with allies.
That's the modern checklist.
Honestly, I feel like every general today should have "Don't be the BEF" printed above their desk.
It wouldn't be bad advice.
All right, final question. You've studied this stuff for decades. Do you see echoes of the BEF in how modern militaries prepare for war?
All the time. We've spent the last 20 years fighting small wars, counterinsurgencies, limited interventions. Now, we're refocusing on peer conflict, and everyone's realizing how unprepared they are for the scale and attrition of large-scale war. It's the same transition Britain faced in 1914.
So history's not just rhyming, it's remixing itself.
Exactly. The uniforms change, the weapons change, but the fundamentals don't.
Well, that's both fascinating and terrifying.
Welcome to military history.
All right, that's our deep dive into Death of an Army, the BEF in France, 1914. The story of how a small, elite force met the brutal math of industrial war, and why it still matters in an age of drones, satellites, and TikTok generals.
You had to get TikTok in there, didn't you?
Of course. History's got to trend somehow.
Fair enough.
All right, folks, thanks for marching through history with us. I'm Hope.
And I'm Brian, reminding you that wars may change, but logistics never do.
And that's a wrap on Mill History Talk. Remember, the past isn't dead. It's just waiting for someone to gossip about it.